Joining us is Robert Daly, director of the Kissinger Institute on China and the United States, and Maria Repnikova, an assistant professor of global communications at Georgia State University, also a former Wilson Center Public Policy Fellow. And her new book, which is coming soon, is entitled Chinese Soft Power. Robert and Maria, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
So what we're going to be talking about today is China and Russia's messaging around the invasion of Ukraine in the wake of them announcing this friendship pact, and how both are handling it both domestically and internationally. And Robert, let me begin with you and just ask you to characterize the nature of this relationship. Was that meeting between Xi and Putin significant in defining something brand new that the world needs to pay attention to, or was it, sort of symbolic but not deep?
So the February 4th meeting and the statement that Xi and Putin issued together, I think, was extremely significant, but not brand new. The two countries have been drawing closer together, at least since 2014, when China became Russia's buyer of last resort after it was sanctioned over the occupation of Crimea. China and Russia obviously also share a very deep interest in not having their choices shaped by the United States, and not having their regimes defined before the world by a global discourse community that they see as unfairly dominated by the United States. This, of course, was exacerbated too during the Trump administration and during the trade war in particular. China seems to have made the decision that the United States fundamentally stands against China's rightful rise and the rightful spread of their power. So this has been in the works for a few years. But on February 4th, on the eve of the Olympics, they really did advance it and announced more than a partnership. Some have called it pro-Russian neutrality. I would go a little further. I think that it's a quasi-alliance in which Xi Jinping said that he was standing really shoulder to shoulder with Putin in a way that he cannot disown relative to Ukraine, much as he might like to.
But alliance, military alliance, ideological alliance, economic alliance, what are the contours?
Well, there's no, you could argue against it being an alliance in that there is no mutual defense pact. They haven't said that an attack on one is an attack on both. But other than that, they have said that it is without limits. Some have described this as they may not always stand with each other, but they will never stand against each other. But their view of the United States and of the United States-led West and NATO is I think they're on the same page on this. And the Chinese, and I should let Maria comment on this, but have been consistent in saying that the main problem with Ukraine, and they have not characterized Russian acts as an invasion, is the United States and NATO's meddling. And there they are standing firmly together, and they are increasing their military cooperation, including things like joint exercises. So no mutual defense pact, but standing shoulder to shoulder in opposition to what they see as an unfairly American-led world order.
Maria, your thoughts. And one way that I'm hearing what Robert is saying is that perhaps it's less about common interests and more about the United States as a foil bringing these two nations together. What is your analysis?
Yeah, I was very much struck by the same, conclusion or sentiment that Robert just talked about, this notion that there is this shared foil, as you put it, between China and Russia when it comes to positioning themselves against the United States. If you look at the official messaging from China and from Russia, but in particular, I was interested in China's perspective here, a lot of emphasis was on the fact that the roots of this conflict between Russia and Ukraine does not lie with Russia or Ukraine, but rather with the United States. So the United States has expanded its military presence, has emboldened NATO, has threatened Russia, and as a result, left Russia no choice but to react. So even though they're not calling it, necessarily, they're not calling it themselves as a support of aggression or war, but they are saying that Russia does have the right to state its legitimate claims when it comes to security and protect its borders. So in this context, we see that there's a strong focus on who is at fault here, which is the United States. And we see the same sentiment portrayed on social media in China with Chinese nationalists and just netizens, social media users, constantly pointing at the United States, the hypocrisy of the United States, and just how much of this whole conflict is about US versus China and Russia, but in particular, this kind of dichotomous view of geopolitics. It's us versus them, which I find to be fascinating and I think somewhat dangerous for where US-China relations are going.
What could both of you tell us about if the populace in China or in Russia to that degree are buying the official line of communication from the state. Do they believe what they're hearing? Are they accepting that the United States is the problem and it's meddling and NATO and there's an actual security threat to Russia?
Well, I think we should go to Maria first for that one. There are different views, but I think that the Chinese netizens are fairly easy to characterize. But I would love to hear her approach to this.
Yes, I'm currently carrying out analysis on Chinese social media discussions on Ukraine. And at least in the first wave of this analysis, we see that the majority of public opinion is about supporting a more nationalistic view. And in fact, indeed blaming the United States for a lot of these problems and this conflicts, not only in Ukraine, but even globally. So I think the patriotic nationalistic sentiment is quite strong, but we do see also some critical voices in support of Ukraine. We see some very small, but nonetheless significant protests and speeches and letters that were posted and aggregated by some professors. So it's not completely unanimous vote. And of course, given that it's a society that has such a strong censorship, right, it's very difficult sometimes to tell how much wider would this voice be of support or empathy towards Ukrainian people if there was more space to express it. On the Russian side, we see somewhat similar dynamics, a little bit different, but similar. In fact, Russian media, I was watching it in the past days, how they're reporting on the war is telling a completely different story, right? It's the opposite reality. You just wouldn't believe how they're portraying every single step of the way, that Russia is winning, Russia is the victim of the West, Russian people are going to survive, and they're going to endure this crisis and come out stronger. It's a completely different reality that people who do watch TV tend to subscribe to. But then again, many young people don't watch TV, they're mostly on social media. And what we see in the past few days is the state trying to limit access to any alternative news and views, right? So we see the only independent media in Russia are being shut down and taken off air. So information environment is getting a lot more homogenous when it comes to pro-Russia views.
That gap that you describe between what the Russian people are being told and what the rest of the world is hearing, is there a similar gap on the Chinese side?
Yes, there is. The Chinese internet space is a little more open, although it's still being closed down, of course, monitored by the Chinese government. There have been some significant dissenting voices coming from Chinese who are trapped in Ukrainian cities. Mm-hmm. Business people and students on the internet, many of whom have been doing impassioned videos that circulate in China, saying you are wrong. Some of them are saying that the mainland nationalists are chusheng, are beasts or animals, stressing that these are human beings who are trying to protect their homes and that they're being slaughtered. So that's been one of the major sources of dissent. But within the Chinese media, their number one strategy is to ignore it or bury the story altogether. If you turn to the major newspapers, they're reporting on the upcoming 2 sessions meetings. They're reporting on various sort of ephemeral stuff that's domestic and ignoring the story altogether. Insofar as it's there, it's reiterating the history of NATO's eastward expansion, and the perfidy of that, the pressure that Russia was put under. And other than that, discussion within China has been largely closed down, but there are gaps in the internet through which some Chinese can get alternate views.
Maria, is it possible for you to describe for us sort of what this information ecosystem looks like? In other words, what are the mechanisms for communicating these messages? What percentage of it is state-run media? What part of it is disinformation campaigns from shady operatives that we can't even fully tie to the state? How much of it is achieved through censorship?
Mm-hmm. Well, the first thing to note, I think, in the Chinese context is that when it comes to sensitive foreign policy issues, there's a lot of censorship and guidance of how these issues are portrayed, both on social media and in official state media. And as Robert just mentioned, the issue has been underplayed for the past week. It's been fascinating to watch just the front pages and the websites of key media outlets just not really featuring Ukraine. And just in the past 2 days, we see CGTN, the global arm of Chinese central television station, starting to actually report about Ukraine and from Ukraine. So I see this as a very much kind of a tightly controlled narrative and a lot of instructions and guidance being delegated from the top down, basically, because this issue is considered sensitive. Even reporting on Russia in any negative way is considered to be very sensitive. So reporting about protests taking place in Russia and any critiques of Russia, I think is not allowed at the moment. So I see this information climate as tightly controlled, but at the same time, as Robert mentioned, there is some space on social media. There always has been on most issues, a little bit of space for some critique, for some alternative views. It's a more porous environment. So even though you have gatekeepers, there is a lot more speed with which information gets out. So you do see some of these Chinese nationals in Ukraine posting images. You do see some, critical voices from within China coming out. But at the same time, they've been quite quickly shut down as well. I've seen some messages disappear very, very swiftly when they start to express critical views about China's in Ukraine and about Russia, Ukraine.
Do we have any reason to suspect that there's any direct coordination on messaging between China and Russia?
I'll be interested in Maria's view. I haven't seen any evidence of that kind, and we have seen some evidence of miscommunication. China did not want this invasion. I think it's important to note that China has good relations with Ukraine. They're a major importer of wheat and corn and energy. China's Belt and Road transits Ukraine. China has trumpeted this very successful relationship. Furthermore, the invasion of Ukraine really puts China's leaders in a box. It flies in the face of everything they've been telling their own people about China's virtuous foreign policy. We respect borders. We oppose violence. We never interfere in the internal affairs of other countries. They haven't figured out a way yet to have it both ways. So they're making very bland general statements of principle on either side of the issue. But I think on the whole, China really would rather that this had not occurred, and it makes Xi look terrible. He very badly misjudged the United States, NATO, the West, Ukrainian resistance, Russian competence, and his poor judgment is now, I think, very firmly, undeniably on display, just as China heads into its annual 2 sessions meetings, which are supposed to set the table for Xi Jinping's getting at least a 3rd term in office and possibly lifelong leadership later this year. And so this does not work well for Xi Jinping. China knows that it is now firmly in international eyes in the Russia, Iran, North Korea, Cuba club, and that's not necessarily where they want to be.
Maria, about the specific messaging we've been hearing from China, as Robert mentioned, not labeling this an invasion, yet calling for diplomacy and de-escalation. There's a sense that they're trying to have it both ways, siding with Russia, but almost half-heartedly. What do you see?
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting pattern to observe. It's a very ambiguous language. At the same time, I think this ambiguity allows for it to be, its discourse to be kind of co-opted by different parties. So for instance, you talked about coordination on messaging. So in the context of Russia, I don't think we see direct coordination, but we do see Russian media kind of co-opting some of these messages from China and taking advantage of them to argue that China stands with Russia. So in Russian media, I've noticed quite a few examples when they would say, we're not alone, right? Russia is standing with us, China is standing with us. And we have this partner that's very significant and much more important than many other countries who denied or don't want to work with us or are blaming us or fighting against us. So basically positioning China as kind of an ally, as a very significant ally, even though the language China itself is using is much more ambiguous. So basically Russian media is kind of taking advantage of the fact that it is ambiguous, stretching it to basically claim that they have someone out there for them and someone as strong and powerful as China. So I found that to be interesting. And of course, I think on the American side, we also saw that some of the narratives were taking into consideration. We're saying, well, China is actually not supporting Russia because they're not, vetoing, they're abstaining, right? So that was kind of seen as a victory by some analysts. So because it's so vague, one can argue either way. So I think it's an interesting strategy, but that is the strategy they have undertaken. Ambiguous, somewhat siding, but not completely. How is it going to work in its favor if this war drags on? That would be an interesting thing to observe.
So you're questioning whether or not that strategy has legs. Can it last for more than a couple weeks?
If this continues on, if it's not going to be resolved quickly, how can you continue to stand in this ambiguous phase? And as Robert mentioned, Xi Jinping can be judged as as basically misleading, but also as misjudging, as not having the right sense of the events.
Yeah, if this gets protracted, there will be more and more information within China. And I think that China's position becomes incredible. They're trying to present themselves as an honest broker. 2 days ago, China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi had a conversation with the Ukrainian Foreign Minister, looking for help, looking for China to use some of its influence with Russia. We now know that the United States had also been doing this for several weeks, sharing intelligence with China before the invasion, asking them to weigh in. Not only did China not weigh in to dissuade Putin, they shared the intelligence, not terribly surprising. And this is going to become untenable if the suffering and possibly the slaughter in Ukraine is protracted. the Chinese foreign minister, in speaking to the Ukrainian foreign minister, gave the usual blandishments. Of course, we respect every country's territorial integrity, but we also understand Russia's legitimate security interests. Now, the Chinese are very careful never to spell out what those legitimate security interests are. The language is extremely dodgy, and it's designed primarily to tell the Chinese people that we are not involved and we are maintaining our virtuous foreign policy. But many of the Chinese are very sophisticated consumers of this kind of thing. And as the body count goes up, I'm not sure it's going to be tenable.
Is there a role for President Xi to be a broker here? You talked about him being boxed in, and we hear the same kind of analysis as it relates to Vladimir Putin, and a lot of discussion that we have to help Putin find an off-ramp. Can Xi, by helping Putin find an off-ramp, find himself an off-ramp?
In theory, he could, and we can be sure that if there is an off-ramp, that China will claim credit for it, whether that has happened or not, that they will be acting in the service of peace. But Xi Jinping himself has been extremely risk averse. They don't want to spend any capital to try to produce a solution here.
Maria, at what point does close ties for China with Russia create sort of a ball and chain effect for China, whose ambitions and whose economy are a mismatch when it comes to Russia? Russia GDP, I think, the size of Texas, versus one of the most powerful, one or two, depending on which day we measure it, economies on planet Earth. Is this ultimately something that doesn't work for China because there's a mismatch in long-term ambitions?
Well, I've been always a bit skeptical about just how close China and Russia really are. I mean, we talked about this major declaration, and it is very symbolic, and there is increasing closeness in rhetoric. But I think in terms of economic relations, military cooperation, we still don't see as much closeness as one would expect from very complementary economies. I mean, for all these years, there could have been a lot more development on the border, for instance, China-Russia border, a lot more codependence in its economic spheres. Essentially, they're not taking advantage of each other as much as they could have. So I think on the other side, we also see Russia is, I think, acknowledging that China is the grand partner, it's the more powerful partner. There's also suspicion and fear of China as much as they're collaborating. I don't think they see themselves as equals. So basically, to answer your question, whether or not China will eventually start seeing this relationship as perhaps not so much in its favor, it's possible, and then they could kind of shift out of it because the language has been so ambivalent anyway. They could always say, well, at this point, maybe the security interests of Russia have been legitimately expressed, and it's enough, and we can kind of shift out. So because the language has not been that explicit, I think they leave some room for themselves to distance themselves from Russia. Although I imagine it's going to be hard, but I think it's not impossible.
Keeping their options open.
The war drags on. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. Is it so? Robert, what are your thoughts on this, on the long-term implications for this relationship? At what point does China decide that a country that has isolated itself from the world, that is being cut off from the global economy, that has lots of cracks in its economic strength or lack thereof, at what point does China decide this isn't in our best interest, even if it's a great tool to antagonize the United States and the West?
Well, I think you used exactly the right word, which is isolation. Does China want to share in Russia's isolation? How isolated is China?
Well, Belt and Road would say no.
Belt and Road would say no. China's COVID experience comes down a little bit on the other side. They say that their takeaways from COVID are that isolation, authoritarianism, and surveillance work. And so China is at a juncture where I think it's torn between its internationalist, integrationist strain and its growing isolationist strain. China is going to see, as the war in Ukraine progresses, the rest of the world increasingly horrified. They're seeing NATO coming together. They're seeing Germany increase its defense budget. They are seeing Sweden and Finland having a dialogue about whether they may want to join NATO. And this is now a NATO that is focused not just on Russia, but on China. They seem to have underestimated how viable the transatlantic alliance might still yet be. So standing with Russia may work for them ideologically vis-a-vis the United States. But will it work for them vis-a-vis the Belt and Road Initiative and their desire to be seen as providing global public goods and to be seen as a partner by the rest of the world, if they're also seen as sort of inextricably in bed, if that's a permissible phrase, with China?
Yeah. Maria, I mentioned your book Upfront, which now is available as a digital download and will soon be available to purchase as a hard copy. Maybe by the time people see this, that'll be available. tie the topic of your book to the conversation we've been having, right? It overlaps throughout, but what are the implications from what your book talks about and what these current events are doing in terms of Chinese soft power?
Yeah, so the book is quite actually practically oriented to basically argue and explain how Chinese soft power works and doesn't work. And it showcases that its ambitions are very grand and they've been investing significantly into various public diplomacy instruments, but in reality, they're actually still facing a lot of pushback from global public opinion, including public opinion in global south. So even in spaces or contexts where we would expect a lot of support, there's still a lot of resistance, as well as operational challenges that China faces in implementing its soft power. So I guess tying it back to this overall topic, China already has a pretty deep understanding that it does need to improve its image, but also it struggles with its image making. And one of the big struggles is credibility of its image. In particular, you can spend all this money and infuse and give a lot of material offerings, but if you're seen as this authoritarian regime and you're seen as controlling your media sources and so forth, you might not be trusted regardless of how much money you spend. So I think this issue continues and kind of taggles along throughout China's soft power efforts. And so in this context, we see that China is just coming out of Olympics, right? It was supposed to be a grand victory and this grand celebration. And I think New York Times called it the joyless Olympics, which is a very interesting choice of phrase. So they're just coming out of this grand spectacle and they're immediately, going into this very contentious and problematic crisis where they're not quite seen as the good guy on the global sphere. So the image gains that they might have gotten from the Olympic Games, which already I think were kind of minor or not as grand as they may have imagined, are further diminished by the fact that now this whole Olympic Games spectacle is overshadowed by the war in Ukraine, and China is seen as siding with Russia, at least by the international community, or is not doing enough as a peacemaker or as a mediator. Mm-hmm. So essentially, this kind of conflict that underscores again the limitations of China's soft power reach and the struggles of making its image viable and crafting an image that really suits and fits, I guess, global discourses about what the international order actually looks like and what role does China play in it.
It's like those Olympics never happened, right? You and I did a conversation before the Olympics, and we talked about China's expectations and how they would benefit or not from this and the messaging that would flow from it. And in the wake of what's happened in Ukraine, it's almost an afterthought.
Right, last month's forgotten news.
Yeah.
I want to ask both of you a question that I learned. I'll be honest. Pull back the curtain. When I was a student in a documentary class taught by a 60 Minutes producer, she said her favorite question in an interview was to say, "Hey, I'm a generalist and you're the experts. What am I missing? What haven't we talked about that's important to this story?" So I'm gonna ask you that question, and with complete humility, with two deep content experts, what haven't we talked about that's really relevant to this discussion today?
I want to come back to the global and especially the European context and the question of how this is seen, especially in Eastern Europe, in Central Europe, places where China has made inroads, also had some setbacks, but countries are making judgments about China now that are going to have a profound impact on the way they deal with it for the coming decades. I was on the phone earlier this morning with a group of Germans, and they see the environment shifting very, very rapidly, and they're coming around more to the American view. And I think that we need to pay attention to that. Maria, I'd love to hear your views on the Baltics, especially this question the Baltics have of whether they're next. What is this doing to China's ambitions in the now 16+1? I think that we need to broaden the context and not just look at the United States and China, but we need to see it in a Eurasian context.
Mm-hmm. Maria, maybe you want to respond to Robert's question first, and then anything else that you'd like to add that I've left out through my questions.
I guess my exposure thinking about the Baltics is more through the personal lens of coming from Latvia and keeping in touch with various friends and acquaintances there and looking at a bit of the media landscape there as well. I think it's quite a divided public opinion. Also, there are Russian speakers who watch Russian news and they think that Russia is justified in what it's doing in Ukraine. Of course, they're not seeing the full picture either. So some of them are actually very supportive of Putin, but I think overall Baltic states, not just Latvia, but Lithuania and Estonia, the leaders, the politicians and civil society are very, very concerned. I think there's a really stark concern about Russia's potential actions in their own countries. It's still very fresh memories. It's not that long ago that, these countries became independent from the Soviet Union. The memory is very, I think, it's very much there. So this is a stark reminder. Some people are calling it like PTSD. They're remembering things that they experienced in their generations, their parents, their grandparents. So there's, I think, quite significant fear. And China not participating in somehow resolving this crisis or not doing enough, as Robert is saying, it might carry on to potentially shape its reputation as maybe a less reliable partner. Although I think there's already been quite a bit of, I think, suspicion or at least cynicism about how far will China go. So I'm not sure this crisis is going to fundamentally reshape how people think about China in the world. I think there's already been kind of the understanding that China won't meddle in many of these major conflicts, and that it's mainly after its own economic interest. That's kind of the overall perception. So will it really shape or reshape how people think about China? I guess it remains to be seen, but I think there's quite a bit of skepticism to start with.
Any thoughts on things that we haven't discussed yet that you think are really important to this discussion?
Well, I guess something that I found a little bit frustrating sometimes in Western media coverage of the conflict, there's been a lot of blame of ordinary Russians. I mean, there's been some sympathy, but also just a lot of kind of slogans and sayings that you should go protest. If you come out in high numbers, large enough numbers, you can get rid of Putin. Is this a collapse of Putin as we know it? Is this a collapse of Putin's Russia and the regime? And when you look at it from the ordinary Russian's perspective, it is very dangerous, to come out and express oneself. There's a lot of restrictions and a lot of police harassment and detentions. So it's just a really harsh climate to express one's opinion against the war. So I think that's just something that sometimes gets a little bit lost in translation, if you will. And I think we should encourage, of course, large-scale demonstrations, but also be mindful that it's actually a huge risk, a huge personal risk for someone to come out against Putin in Russia.
Yeah, no, great point. Right, it's easy to be brave from a distance, but when you're right there and facing the consequences. I do want to ask both of you something else before we close out our discussion, and it's about the speaking of messaging, which is the framing that we used to begin this. We've seen some pretty alarming messaging relating to nuclear weapons and the potential use of nuclear weapons from the Russian side of the equation. I want to get your thoughts on that messaging. Is it an attempt at intimidation? Is it a threat that must be taken seriously? And then also, what does China make of that?
In a lot of the Western reporting, this has been attributed to the alleged personal pathologies of Vladimir Putin. Mm-hmm. It's highly personalized.
Armchair psychology.
A new czar, that is he unstable? Is he crazy? I don't know of anyone who's got real insight into that. Mm-hmm. You can be sure that the nuclear threat is alarming to China, which historically is deeply worried about the Russian arsenal and has thought that it might be a target of that in the past. It's clearly escalatory, whether it's personalized or not, but I don't think that we have a clear understanding of it. Again, not to just psychologize Putin, they are making fairly unprecedented moves in rapid succession, which suggests a lack of planning and suggests confusion and surprise on Russia's side. And that will alarm China because Xi Jinping is cautious. He won't like Vladimir Putin's brinksmanship, and he won't like this kind of rapid escalation. But he made his declaration on February 4th. He cannot walk that back, and he cannot admit a mistake, especially this year when he's going for lifelong tenure.
Yeah, Maria, the rhetoric coming from Russia is on a level of what we've been used to hearing from North Korea.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, it's a pretty scary rhetoric, but I don't have too much to add in terms of Robert's assessment. I agree that China is rightfully alarmed about this messaging, and it's a very fast-changing environment. It's extremely unstable. It's hard to respond to. So I think China, like everyone else, is extremely concerned about what's happening. At the same time, we know very little. So far, everything I've read, there are all kinds of predictions, but everybody's trying to get into Putin's head, so to speak, right? So, and it's a pretty much impossible task. So some of the more, I guess, rational thinkers will say that's just this threat. He's cornered. He's simply, warmongering and so forth. But others, some analysts of Russian studies have actually said that it's quite serious, and we should be taking his words much more seriously instead of personalizing it. But actually, we should analyze this and respond in a more kind of sobering fashion. So I'm not standing on one way or another, but I'm reading closely all of these accounts, and obviously, deeply concerned. But hopefully, we won't get to that point.
Yeah, that of course is our hope, and of course, our hearts go out to the people in Ukraine, and we hope for a quick resolution, although that doesn't at this moment seem to be in the cards. I want to thank both of you today for sharing your insights on this important topic, and let our viewers know that if you'd like to hear more from the Kissinger Institute and Robert's work, and from Maria, and learn about her new book, visit us at wilsoncenter.org, where you'll also be able to find the Hindsight Upfront Ukraine collection, and previously the Hindsight Upfront Afghanistan collection. And through this series, what we've attempted to do is provide analysis on the implications, and talk about the lessons learned in real time as these events are unfolding, so that it can be useful to peacemakers, policymakers, and others around the globe. Thank you for joining us for this special edition of Wilson Center Now, Hindsight Upfront Ukraine. And we hope you enjoyed it and that you'll be back with us again. Until then, for all of us at the center, I'm John Milewski. Thanks for being here.